Well, hello, and welcome to Faith Seeking Understanding, the online edition. If you don't know much about us, Roland and I started Faith Seeking Understanding with the goal of equipping Christians to think within a biblical worldview for the sake of knowing God and serving Him better. Usually we run these modules in person, but given the fact that we're facing a global pandemic, we thought it best to maintain social distancing and to run everything online in this format. That of course comes with some challenges. Usually the way our talks have gone is that we'll talk for a bit, and after each major section we'd break for some questions or comments, and in that way it would be a bit more interactive. Obviously that's not possible in the current format. We're just going to be missioning through and doing the full talk all in one go, but we do still want to hear your questions and comments. So if you're watching on our website, you can hit the button that says ask a question, fairly self-explanatory. Otherwise, if you're watching on YouTube, there'll be a link in the description below. So if you go look there, you'll find what you're looking for. If you do ask a question, please try get them in by Friday. This is assuming that you're actually watching the talk in the week that that it goes live. For each talk, the subsequent Monday, we'll be posting a follow-up video with questions and answers, or questions and responses, as I prefer to call it. We're not guaranteeing you any answers, but so we would like to hear your questions, but we would like to have those in by the Friday, just so we can have a little bit of time to prepare and make sure that we get all our ducks in a row to put that up by the Monday. Now, this module kicks off season 2 of Faith Seeking Understanding, and in this season we'll be focusing mainly on humanity. In this first module we'll be doing biblical theology, looking at 5 key figures in the Bible story. Each figure will help us to see how God works through His people to accomplish His plans and purposes. All of this obviously culminates in Jesus and opens up the way, who opens up the way to a new creation, free of suffering, sin, and death. Now, we have done biblical theology before. That was the first module that we did in season 1. It was a module that we called God with Us. There we thought together about what biblical theology is, some of the beginning steps of how we go about it, and then we did 3 case studies that all really focused in on God dwelling in the midst of His people, different aspects of that, hence the name, God with Us. Now in this module we'll be assuming some of what we said there. Hopefully the way that this comes across is that if you haven't checked out our first module from season 1, you'll still be able to make sense of what we say in this module. That said, we are going to be assuming the things that we said in that module. So if you do want to dig deeper, if you do want to get a bit more perspective on some of what we're saying, then I would recommend that you go and check out our first module. And you can find that on our website, faithseekingunderstanding.co.za. Now, in this series, we're thinking together about God's people throughout the Bible story in various capacities. We're going to be thinking about the patriarch, the mediator, the king, the servant. But in some sense, all of that assumes a fundamental idea of what it means to be human, what true humanity looks like, and as we'll see, what it doesn't look like. All of this begins, of course, in the creation account where God told us, in some sense, what humanity was meant to be like. So we begin then, I think, in a fitting place. We begin with the first 3 chapters of our Bible, Genesis 1 to 3. So it might be helpful for you to turn there if you've got a Bible with you. Otherwise, you can just listen. So let's look at the Genesis prologue, and we'll start with Genesis 1 to 3. The creation account works as a sort of introduction to Genesis, to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, that is, from Genesis to Deuteronomy. And in fact, it works as an introduction to the whole Old Testament. We could also expand that to the entire Bible, but we'll limit our focus to the Old Testament just for now. It's become a bit of a battleground for things like science versus faith, which is unfortunate because, as many have pointed out, when we spend all our time thinking about issues like that, we miss some of the other details that are going on. And when we spend all our time focusing on that, what we aren't focusing on are the details of the text that actually get us closer to what it's all about. Another problem, one that's usually found at the same time, though not always, is the tendency to see the creation account as its own isolated episode rather than seeing how it ties into the rest of the biblical story. What I'm hoping we'll see from this brief look that we're going to take at Genesis 1-3 is that it's doing far more than just telling us how we ended up existing. It's an introduction to the Old Testament and ultimately to the whole Bible that introduces the key themes that are going to be developed throughout. Now, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now, that phrase, formless and empty, it's worth spending a little bit of time on. The Hebrew tohu wavohu, which we said in our previous module on biblical theology, means something like wild and waste, or desert and wasteland, non-functional, uninhabitable. Another scholar explains it as in its not yet state. Now, what all this is building up to is fruitfulness, a pushing back of the wild and waste on days 1-3, and bringing about order that allows for fruitfulness, and inserting residence into that fruitful world on days 4-6. It's a move from anti-fruitfulness, the tohu wavohu, to being conducive to fruitfulness, which climaxes in verses 29-30, where the living creatures that God has created are invited to enjoy the fruitfulness that has been established. And all of that's capped off with the statement at the end that, and in fact all the way throughout, except day 2, oddly enough, God saw that it was good. At the end, God says that it was very good. We'll come back to that though. The climax comes on day 6. Since day 3, God has been creating various creatures according to their kinds. We've got trees, fish, birds, various land animals. But when we get to humans on day 6, something is different. It's no longer according to their kinds, but in our image. Just what that means has been an ongoing question. A number of attempts have been made to explain this, often singling out different capacities that single us out as humans, that set us apart from the rest of creation. Maybe that we have a soul, or that we're rational creatures, or that we have capacity to love. Number of different things. Maybe capacity for a relationship with God, that's another one. But as one commentator explains, any approach that focuses on one aspect of man, be that physical, spiritual, or intellectual, to the neglect of the rest of man's constituent features, seems doomed to failure. In actual fact, the narrative tells us what being made in God's image consists of. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Now this squares well with what we know from the ancient Near East, where kings would set up images of themselves as a sign of their rule in that area. In similar fashion, the kings in the ancient Near East were thought of as images of the gods. The point is simply this, that God made humans to be his representatives, ruling over the creation, albeit under his own rule. That means that our role as those who are put in charge of ruling and subduing the rest of creation, as well as the faculties and capacities that humans have that enable us to rule. It's both the role itself and those faculties and capacities that enable us to fulfill that role that make up what it means to be made in the image of God. Now, it's worth mentioning that all humans are made in God's image, male and female. I trust that should be taken as a given. I take it that in some sense didn't need to be said. But it is important to mention here, because going forward we are going to be talking mainly about Adam. We're going to be talking about the nation of Israel as a new Adam, Christ as a new Adam, and so on. And what we'll see is that humanity in general ultimately is in view, at least for what that means for us, and especially as God works to recover what true humanity is meant to look like, which was lost at the fall. Again, something we'll come to in a bit. But the way that works itself out in the Bible story is mainly with reference to one figure, and that is Adam. So God created humans in his image to exercise dominion over creation on his behalf. God reaches the end of his creation with humans and declares that it's all very good. Unlike the rest of the land creatures, humans aren't just partakers in fruitfulness. They're meant to be stewards over it. This is what is behind the command in verse 28. Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. That then is expanded on in chapter 2 in some sense, where the narrator sort of zooms in on humanity. Adam is placed in the Garden of Eden, which is a sort of temple where God lived with his people in perfect relationship. And the call to fill and subdue the world was a call to, as one writer puts it, extend the geographical boundaries of the garden until Eden covered the whole earth. God's intention is to fill the whole world with his blessing. And he wants to do that through his people. So again, same writer, we can speak of Genesis 1:28 as the first Great Commission, which was repeatedly applied to humanity. The commission was to bless the earth, and part of the essence of this blessing was God's salvific presence. But in chapter 3, another character is introduced. Now, the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. That word crafty, NIV and ESV, cunning in the CSB, it's an interesting one. For one, there's only one letter difference between the word for naked, one verse earlier in 2:25, man and woman were naked and without shame. Arum for cunning, and arom for naked. We'll come back to that in just a moment. Secondly, arum, cunning, only appears in one other part of the Hebrew Bible, and that's in the book of Proverbs. But in Proverbs, it's only ever used in a positive sense. Not so much cunning as it is prudent or resourceful. Now, that isn't all from these opening chapters that appears in Proverbs. In Proverbs 3:28, wisdom is spoken of as a tree of life, which plays a prominent role in the creation accounts. That by which humans enjoy eternal life. And the rest of chapter 3 and chapter 8 of Proverbs, wisdom is spoken of generally using creation type language, the sort of language that calls to mind the creation accounts in the opening chapters of Genesis. Now, bring this together, and what is Genesis 3 about? Well, in one sense, it's about wisdom. Will the humans that God has placed in the garden, the humans he's allowed to live in harmony with him, in perfect relationship, in his presence, will they seek his wisdom? Or will they seek wisdom on their own terms? That, in effect, is what the tree of the knowledge of good and evil stood for. Bruce Waltke explains the phrase good and evil as a merism for all moral knowledge, the capacity to create a system of ethics and make moral judgments. In a similar vein, Tremper Longman explains that knowing good and evil isn't so much about understanding what is good and evil, a mere intellectual knowledge, if you will, but it's deciding for ourselves. John Walton takes a different angle. He doesn't agree with either of them, and suggests that it does have something to do with knowing good and evil, like actual knowing as understanding, talking about as discerning and discriminating wisdom. And with such wisdom, there's a sense in which they would be like God, which is an idea that comes up twice in chapter 3. This wisdom isn't a bad thing. It's something that God wanted to cultivate in them. The problem comes when Adam and Eve grasp for it on their own terms, rather than waiting for God and his timing. Now, it isn't so urgent that we choose between these different interpretations. What is clear is that this passage is about wisdom and how humans try to seize it on their own terms rather than waiting for God and on his terms. It's worth remembering what we said in our most recent module, The Good Life, about wisdom, that it isn't merely intellectual. It isn't less than that, but it certainly is more. So even if we do take a view like Walton's view, the practical outworking of wisdom is still the sort of thing that we should have in view, I think. Now, what happens in Genesis 3 becomes a pattern of human sinfulness that will show itself over and over again throughout the Bible story. Notice Eve's reaction in verse 6. She saw that the fruit was good. This is the first time in the narrative that anybody other than God has seen something and judged it to be good. But as John Walton explains, with people as the source and the center of wisdom, the result is not order centered on them, but disorder. The disorder extended to all people of all time, as well as the cosmos, and life in God's presence was forfeited. As soon as they ate, their eyes were opened and they realized that they were naked. Verse 7. We said we'd come back to the idea of nakedness. So remember, in 2:25, we're told that the man and the woman were arom. They were naked and they felt no shame. Then we're introduced to the serpent, who's called arum. Just one verse later, crafty or cunning. So from the get-go, we know that the snake's cunning and the human's nakedness are going to feature together in some way. We're just waiting to find out how. Except that when they do come together, a slightly different word is used for nakedness. The eyes of both of them were opened in 3 verse 7, and they realized that they were arom. Both mean naked. The difference is that the word in 3 verse 7 comes with connotations of shame, which aren't quite there in 2:25. The same word is used in Deuteronomy 28, where the Israelites are told that if they don't remain faithful to the covenant that God has set before them, then there are a whole lot of curses and that are going to come upon them. So we read in Deuteronomy 28 verses 47 to 48, "Because you did not serve the Lord your God joyfully and gladly in the time of prosperity, therefore in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and dire poverty, you will serve the enemies the Lord sends against you. He will put an iron yoke on your neck until he's destroyed you." One scholar explains it this way, that the effect of the fall was not simply that the man and the woman came to know that they were arom, naked. Specifically, they came to know that they were arom, also naked, in the sense of being under God's judgment, as in Deuteronomy 28. Now, Deuteronomy 28 goes on to say that if the Israelites continue in their rebellion, they'll be uprooted from the land, which is exactly what happens to Adam and Eve. For their rebellion against God, they're sent into exile on the east side of the garden, the land that God gave to his people. Now, just as they were to work and keep the garden in 2 verse 15, in 3:23 and 24, they're sent off to work the ground, and they're kept from the tree of life. This is the pattern that the rest of the Bible story is going to follow. Greg Beale sums it up helpfully. 1, cosmic chaos, followed by 2, new creation, 3, commission of kingship for divine glory, 4, sinful fall, and 5, exile. And we've seen all 5 of those steps there in the opening chapters of Genesis. Now, the madness continues in chapter 4. Adam and Eve have kids, Cain and Abel, but when Abel's sacrifice is accepted and Cain's isn't, Cain gets upset. God comes to him and warns him that sin desires to have him, but that he must rule over it, which is the same language that's used in Genesis 3 of the woman desiring her husband, and but him ruling over her. Sin is also described in animal-like terms, again taking us through a cycle of the animals ruling over the humans rather than the other way around, a sort of inversion of the commission that God gave them in chapter 1. Now Cain doesn't rule over the sin. Instead he kills his brother, and the rest of the chapter is spent telling us how humanity spiraled downward into chaos, back into the wild and waste of Genesis 1 verse 2. All this reaches a head in chapter 6, reaches an all-time low where God saw how the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. So because disorder is what the people wanted, disorder is what God gave them. God's judgment in the flood, it's a descent back into the chaotic waters in 1 verse 2, back into the wild and waste, the tohu wavohu, where everything began. But there is a glimmer of hope. The Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Through this decreation, this descent back into chaos, Noah is spared. God tells him to build a tevat, an ark, a big boat, which Noah, his family, and a bunch of animals are to find shelter from the chaotic waters. Noah, his family, and a bunch of animals are preserved through God's judgment. By the time we reach chapter 9, we've come full circle. Genesis 1 began with God pushing back the chaotic waters and bringing order for humanity to live in the land and to subdue it. The flood waters receding replays that scene in a sense, where the chaotic waters give way to order and humanity being blessed and once again commissioned to fill and subdue the land. The words of Genesis 1:28 are virtually copy-pasted. Then God blessed Noah and his sons, saying to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the land." Things aren't quite back to the way they were. There are important differences between chapter 9 and chapter 1 that make clear that things are still broken. But the similarities are what I want us to focus on for now. In repeating the commission to Noah, there is a sense in which Noah was meant to be a new Adam. It's almost as if God is giving humanity another shot. But just as Noah replayed Adam's commissioning, so he also replayed Adam's failure. God planted the garden in 2 verse 8. Noah planted a vineyard in 9 verse 20. Adam took and ate of the tree. Noah drank of the fruit of the vine. Both falls involve nakedness in some way. Cursed is the serpent in 3 verse 14. Cursed is Canaan in 9 verse 25. It's no accident that there's so much of the same language, or at least the same sort of language. What the author is trying to get us to see is just how Noah is a new sort of Adam. But like the first Adam, one who fails to fill and subdue the earth. So come back to Beale's 5 steps. We've seen 1, cosmic chaos in God's decreation in the flood, followed by 2, God's new creation when the flood waters receded. 3, the commission to be fruitful and multiply, the call to rule over God's creation as his stewards. 4, sinful fall, again involving a tree, some fruit, nakedness, curses, and so on. And in the next story, we cap it off with 5, exile. We see this in the story of Babel in chapter 11. In Genesis 11, the people do the exact opposite of what God told them to do. He told them to fill the earth and subdue it, and instead they decide to stay in one place and make a name for themselves. God doesn't like this, so he confuses their languages so that they can't carry on working together and instead scatter all over the place. It's as if God's saying, you don't want to fill the earth? Fine. How about I make you? We're meant to imagine a sort of sending out of the comfortable conditions they aspired to make for themselves, away from the hopes and dreams of a prosperous future in a city that reaches to the heavens. But how exactly is this exile? Well, I think 2 details point us in that direction. 2 details that I think might be a little bit easy to miss. The first is that is there in verse 2, as the people moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. Think back to Genesis 3:24. When Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden, the author makes a point of telling us that they're put on the east side of the garden. Later in Genesis, Lot and Abraham go their separate ways, and Lot chooses the land to the east. The east has bad connotations. And I think if we link it back to Genesis 3:24, the implication is that it has exile connotations. The second clue, I think, is the name Babel, which is short for Babylon. And if we think about who would have written Genesis, it's likely that the name Babylon would have come with some bad connotations. Again, exile connotations. That's where the nation of Israel land up by the end of 2 Kings. That's how I think we're meant to read Genesis 1-11, as an introduction not only to Genesis, but to the whole Old Testament story. The Israelites in exile in Babylon would have read Genesis 1-11 and seen in summary fashion the same sort of journey that they went on as a nation. But we'll come back to that later. The next section that we want to look at is Abraham as a new Adam. Out of exile, God called Abraham. From the way that the narrative is set up, I think we're meant to see Abraham as a new Adam figure. I suspect that most of us are accustomed to hearing about the differences between Adam and Abraham. Some of those differences are really important, but the language that's used here of Abraham and his family also points us to a significant continuity between him and Adam. Adam was told to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and to rule. God promised Abraham in Genesis 12 that he would bless him, that he would be a conduit of blessing for all the families of the earth. And in Genesis 17, God makes a covenant with him and says, I will multiply you exceedingly. I'll make you exceedingly fruitful. And we see the same sort of language crop up again and again as Genesis continues in the next generations of Abraham's family. Earlier we noticed the parallels between Adam and Noah. Noah is also told to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. But when we look a little closer, we also see parallels between Noah and Abraham. We read in Genesis 8, then God said to Noah, go out of the ark. And so Noah went out, and a little while later he built an altar to the Lord. Then in Genesis 12, God said to Abraham, go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land that I will show you. So Abraham went and he built an altar to the Lord. In 9 verse 1, God blessed Noah, and we've already noticed the abundant blessings in verses 1-3 of chapter 12. In 9 verse 9, God says, I will establish my covenant with you and your seed In 12 verse 7, God says to Abraham, I will give your seed this land, which doesn't quite sound like the same thing until we read a few chapters later and see that God establishes his covenant with Abraham about giving the land to his seed. So what we're meant to see is that Abraham is a new sort of Adam figure. Not just Abraham though, his seed, his descendants, the line that's going to come from Abraham, which means Israel. The whole nation of Israel find their origins in Abraham. And so that's the next place that we want to look. We want to think about Israel as a new Adam. And we'll do this in two parts. First, we'll think about the nation of Israel as the clump of people from Exodus to Deuteronomy. The promises made to Abraham are mainly about the fate of his descendants. Actually, not very much has to do with Abraham himself. A lot of it has to do with what is then going to be passed on to his descendants and how the story is meant to unfold for them. The rest of the story of Genesis has to do with Abraham's family growing, ending with the generations of Jacob in chapter 37, who gets renamed Israel. The story of Joseph is then told, which gives us a sort of backstory for how Abraham's family actually end up in Egypt, which brings us finally to the second book of the Bible. From the word go, we notice that the story of Exodus is couched in creation language. The people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Or that couched in creation language, some of the other language that we've emphasized already of multiplying and growing and swarming and stuff. In chapter 2, we're introduced to Moses. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, the way that a character is introduced is incredibly important for what that character is going to end up doing. There are really important details that are almost always encapsulated there in the introduction to characters. And that's definitely the case with Moses. Pharaoh is freaked out by the rapidly increasing Israelites and orders that their baby boys are drowned. So Moses' mother, not wanting that to happen to him, puts Moses in a tevat, which maybe you remember from earlier is the same word used for ark. Here in Exodus, it's probably a basket, and that's the way that it gets translated in our English Bibles. But it's the same word, tevat, as the ark in Noah's story. I'm now picturing Noah being saved from a massive flood in a basket. Anyway, the Exodus goes on to tell what we might think of as the archetypal rescue story of the Old Testament. The one that the rest of the Old Testament will point back to and say, remember what the Lord did back in Egypt. And that's couched in creation language. The sort of language where an ark actually makes a lot of sense. The Israelites were saved from the Egyptians through chaotic waters, if we think of what happened at the Red Sea. Exodus 14 verse 21, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind. Genesis 8 verse 1, God remembered Noah and sent a wind over the earth and the waters receded. We also see creation language in Deuteronomy, and now they've come out of slavery in Egypt, and now they're going into the promised land. This is a generation later for details that for reasons that we're not going to go into now. But now they're on the brink of the promised land, and they're about to go in. And Moses speaks to them and says, "You saw no form of any kind the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb out of the fire. Therefore, watch yourselves very carefully, so that you do not become corrupt and make for yourselves an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or a woman, or like any animal on the earth, or any bird that flies in the air, or any creature that moves along the ground, or any fish in the waters below. When you look up into the sky and see the sun, the moon, the stars, all the heavenly array, do not be enticed into bowing to them and worshipping things the Lord your God has apportioned to all the nations under heaven. But as for you, the Lord took you and brought you out of the iron smelting furnace, out of Egypt, to the people of his inheritance, as you now are. Deuteronomy 4:15-20. The Israelites are called not to turn away from the Lord when they get to the promised land, but notice what the alternative is, that they worship creation. A lot of what's mentioned there, what's mentioned in Genesis 1 is there. That is the alternative to worshiping God. The warning is not to worship the creation rather than the Creator. So, the story from Joshua through Samuel tells us the up and down story of the Israelites actually taking and settling in the promised land. For the sake of time, though, we're going to skip ahead to the book of Kings. 1 Kings opens with the death of David and the installment of King Solomon. Now, when we meet Solomon, we're introduced to him as a sort of new Adam figure. Like Adam, he's said to have dominion. He's said to be knowledgeable about all sorts of things that call the creation account to mind: trees, cattle, birds, creeping things, fish. It's wisdom language. We could add to that the allusions of the creation account in the building of the temple, which you might want to go back to our previous module on biblical theology and check out the talk that we did there, where we focused in on the temple in particular. One scholar summarizes it this way, that Solomon is described as a new Adam who has re-established creation worship in an Eden-like sanctuary. That's how he describes the temple. Now, it all looks very promising, but I'm sure you know the way that the story goes. Solomon has an Achilles heel. In 1 Kings 3 verse 3, we're told that Solomon loved the Lord. But in 11 verse 1, we learn that the Lord isn't the only one that Solomon loves. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women. It isn't Solomon's only vice. There are a few red flags that go up as the story unfolds, but in chapter 11, things really go downhill. So pick up verse 9. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he'd forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you've not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates." Not long after Solomon dies, the kingdom is split in two. And the story of Kings tells a sad tale of how king after king, with very few exceptions, turned their hearts away from God and led his people to worship idols, to worship their own creation rather than the creator of all things. Assyria dragged the northern kingdom off into exile in 2 Kings 17, and we don't hear from them again. 8 chapters later, Judah is dragged off into exile in Babylon. N.T. Wright sums it up really well. Just as Genesis 1-3 tells a story of the human plight through the pattern of glorious beginnings, rich vocations, and then horrible failure and exile, so Genesis 12 through the end of the Old Testament tell the story of Israel with tales of glorious beginnings, rich vocations, and then horrible failure and exile. Again, whoever put Genesis 1-3 into its present form was undoubtedly aware of and undoubtedly intended that resonance to be fully heard. Now, we've seen that the story of Israel's origins is couched in creation language, and that, like Adam, they were told to be fruitful and multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. The mission, at least in some sense, is the same. God is working through his people to fulfill his plans and purposes, to fill the whole world with his blessing. We've seen how this is then picked up with a single person, Solomon, the king of Israel. But the king, at least to some extent, is the people's representative, which means that where the king's heart is at the time, where the king's heart is more often than not an indication of where at least most of the people's hearts are at. Not all of them, but at least most of them. When the king's heart was turned away from God, there was a faithful remnant, but even so, the decisions of the king sealed the fate of the whole nation, who were held accountable for their rebellion against God and tossed off into exile. All this is to say is that the nation of Israel was meant to be a new Adam. It was through the nation of Israel that God was going to work out his plans and purposes to Abraham, and through them that Adam's commission to fill and subdue the whole earth was meant to be completed. But they didn't just share in the commission of Adam, they also shared in the failure of Adam. It is true that in Ezra and Nehemiah they return home and start rebuilding, and things do look like they're off to a good start. But we still get the sense that things aren't quite right, if for no other reason that they're still under foreign rule. They might be back in the land. But exile wasn't truly over. Now, there's plenty more in the Old Testament that we should say, plenty that we actually really shouldn't be leaving out, but for the sake of time, we're going to move over to the New Testament. We're going to think together about Jesus as a new Adam. In the second half of Romans 5, Paul compares Adam and Christ, calling Adam a type of the one to come. Before we get to Romans 5, though, we should think a little bit more about what came before. So in Romans 1:18 to 32, Paul lays out the first part of the problem, that the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Now, there are loads of connections that Paul is making here, some really important ones in fact, but for the sake of time, we're just going to focus on one. As the rest of the chapter unfolds, what we see is that the sin of humans is framed in the language of creation. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. They worshipped the creation rather than the Creator. Chapter 1 is chiefly aimed at Gentiles, but in chapter 2, he turns to the Jews to say that actually the nation of Israel are no better. Despite being entrusted with the very words of God, 3 verse 2, they too are under sin. They too are under God's judgment. All of this is summed up in 3 verse 23, where Paul says that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. But now, God's righteousness has been made known through Jesus. It's been made known through his death, through his resurrection, through which we've also been justified. When Paul sets up a contrast between Adam and Christ in the second half of chapter 5, what I think we're meant to see is that in Jesus, we finally have the answer that we've been looking for. We finally have the person that we've been searching for since page 3 of our Bibles. When we finally have somebody who's obedient and who's faithful, one who took the commission of Adam, the one through whom all the world would be blessed, but without the sin of Adam. And as a new Adam, he's the firstborn of a renewed humanity, a new creation, which we all get to be a part of through him. This idea of new creation reaches a climax in chapter 8, where Paul says that through Jesus we've been made heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom of the glory of the children of God. So if you're tracking with what Paul's been saying here, humans turned their backs on God, choosing to worship the creation rather than the Creator. They exchanged the glory of God for idols, which Paul summed up in 3 verse 23, that humans have fallen short of the glory of God. But Jesus came as a new Adam in chapter 5, and because of his atoning work in chapter 3, we get to be a part of that. In Jesus, so what is it that we're becoming a part of? Well, we're sharing in his glory as creation is made new. In Jesus, all things are being made new, and by virtue of our participation in him, so are we. If anybody is in Christ, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5, they're a new creation. Now, much more could be said. Hopefully some of that will be picked up in the Q&R. Don't forget to leave your questions and comments by Friday if you're watching in real time. More of the picture will hopefully also be filled out as we go along, as we think about more of these people through whom God is fulfilling his plans and purposes. Where I want to end, though, is where we began. Where the Bible story ends is where it began, in a garden, where humans live in perfect relationship with God, enjoying the abundance of his creation, in the joy of being in his presence. That's what we're meant to be thinking when we read the last section of John's vision in Revelation. So I'll give him the last word. We're reading Revelation 22, verses 1 to 5. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. There will be no more night. They will not need the light of a lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will give them light. And they will reign forever and ever.